Well, hey everybody, welcome. My name is John Manna. I'm part of the ServiceNow solutions team here inside of CDW. We are a practice that's focused and dedicated completely to ServiceNow, but not just the platform, not just the product, everything that's around it, the people and process side of the equations as well. And this is part of a series. We do a monthly educational workshop, just like this one today. It focuses on how to leverage or drive more value and ROI out of ServiceNow. It's designed mostly for folks that already own ServiceNow, as well as folks that are about to own ServiceNow. And today's topic is really a hot topic for us here at CDW across our customer base. It's vulnerability response, and specifically the importance of CMDB and how it plays that role. And I'm excited today to have with us our expert in this area. And Rahimi is been a big part of shaping what the solution here at CDW looks like, for the balance of this year and into next. And he comes to us with just a ton of experience, not just in ServiceNow, but in things related to security and integrated risk management. And what I love about the presentation he's put together today is it's incredibly strategic at a high level, but you're going to see some very practical things in here. And again, without further ado, I'm going to get him started here. A couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions during the session, in the panel on the right, there is an area where you can ask questions. If we see them come in, and we might answer those in flight, but at a minimum, either at the end of the session or as a follow-up. And the other thing is as well, there'll be a couple of polls that'll pop up. So questions for you, it'll show up on the right panel. If you can quickly, when you see that pop up, answer that question. And if it's not popping up when you see the poll slide, maybe look at the right panel. There's three dots there that you might have to click on the three dots and kind of see a poll tab open up. But anyway, thanks for joining us. Let's get it started. Rahimi, great to have you and excited about your topic today.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm going to go off video just so we can see the presentation a little bit more clearly. Um, so, as we mentioned, we wanted to talk about vulnerability response, but in particular, just want to just quickly rehash, okay, what is SecOps? Because VR is technically under the umbrella of SecOps. Talk about the workflow, review the maturity model, and then obviously talk about CMDB throughout all the slides that we go through. As mentioned earlier, there are some poll questions just really to help us gauge and guide the conversations. I want this to be more fluid versus me just talking to everybody. So, feel free to message out during the slides, ask questions. We'll see what we can do and try to help drive this conversation. So, next slide, please. So, as I mentioned before, SecOps has primarily two main products. There's a bunch of other core products as well, but really, when you think about it, there's the security incident response module, and then there's the vulnerability response module. So if you look at the security incident response SIR, you're focused more on the operational side, hence the SecOps name, and it's more about your SIM integration, how your SOC works, how you're operationally working through security incidents as a whole in the environment. So like a phishing attack and so forth, things like that. Like how would you interact and work with IT? Vulnerability response, as the name implies, is really focused on the vulnerabilities you find in your infrastructure. So this is where your vulnerability scanners come in and pull information about your infrastructure. And then what do you do with that? And how do you say like patch or make necessary configuration changes or, as we all love to do, update to the latest version of whatever's needed to avoid some type of security issue. So next slide. Thank you, John. So as I mentioned before, it's really about vulnerability scanners, right? So if you look at the product, there's already existing apps available in the ServiceNow store for the vulnerability scanners that are most common in customer environments. We're covering these for now. There's other options in terms of how you integrate other scanners, but these are specific ones that ServiceNow has apps that are already built and that you can download and configure into your vulnerability response infrastructure. Um, in regards to vulnerability management processes and how they're currently done, usually what we have right now is that you have the scanner, one of many, but for this case, let's just talk about what we mentioned earlier. So one of the main ones that are known, you run your scanner, it'll figure out, okay, we found these hosts in your infrastructure, these assets in particular, here's what they are. And then also, because we found these assets, they have these corresponding vulnerabilities, right? And now you've got this list of hosts and vulnerabilities, and you're like, okay, now that I have this, I got to figure out how to fix it. And the remediation process in a manual world usually is, okay, well, I don't know who owns it. I'm gonna go send this off to IT, or I need to figure out who owns it. I need to figure out who's responsible for it. Because sometimes the fact that one person owns it doesn't mean that they're responsible for updating it. And you're really trying to figure out what's going on. I see that there's this is quite a lot where the manual processes are really hard to really even prioritize the work. So you could have a great example is usually you have say an Apache fix that's needed, and it- you have multiple servers that are the same type, same setup, and need the patch. How do you prioritize which one? Does your customer facing server have a higher priority than say the one that has a cafeteria menu, right? Like these are the typical kind of scenarios that you see. And so first poll question is, if you do find a vulnerability in your environment, do you know who owns it? What's the business impact? And also who can fix it? We'll give you guys maybe 15 seconds to kind of just go through here.
Yeah, Rahimi, I think this is a great question to have, right? And I know that for folks who've been around a bit, right, we often talk about RACI matrix and looking at ownership and who should be informed and everything else. Easier said than done, and a lot of times those things can get created but aren't necessarily maintained, right? So yeah, interesting to see what the group has to say. It's coming in, it's looking interesting, maybe about 50-50 in
Oh,
terms of
nice.
yes and
Nice.
no. Yeah. Yeah, so we got 25 folks said yes, 20 said no. We got a bunch that couldn't find their clicker button. So it's about split, right? With a little bit more than half feeling comfortable that they do know the answer to what's up here.
Oh, that's great. That's great. All right. Well, let's continue on.
All righty.
All right. So we'll talk about the workflow. Um, First steps usually, like we mentioned, you get your scanner, you integrate. Um, this is where the data gets organized and collected. And then the next part is what we're probably going to focus on most of the presentation is really like, well, how do you prioritize and organize and what's going on? And that data is really a byproduct of the CMDB and working with that. Then you go to the triage, obviously, once you've prioritized to figure out who gets what done, working through that. If there's some changes that need to happen, so change management's kicked in, you coordinate that, work through some of those steps. And finally, once all of that's been coordinated and worked through, you have this completed loop that is that the scanner runs again and sees, hey, has this been resolved? Do I see this particular vulnerability again in the infrastructure? Um, Here's the maturity model for vulnerability response, right? So usually what we're seeing is a lot of manual processes, obviously maturity level 0, spreadsheets. You've got a rough idea of what's going on. Uh, some things you think, hey, I'm responding really quickly, but in actuality, you might be because of a misunderstanding and prioritization, you might be taking a lot longer to solve some of the more critical stuff. Again, no real heavy sense of where things are and what's going on. And if you look at like the automated prioritization, which is really where you want to move towards and start out at, which would be level 1, this is key, right? A single system of record. you're starting to consolidate where information is, where people live in terms of like the vulnerability team. They can go into one place, figure out what's going on, where things are going, how to point them to what, and then figure out what the priorities are and uh, add some visibility into it. And so the visibility part is really more on like reports and stuff like that. We're not going to cover that as much. What we really want to cover is just the concept of, well, how do you get to the point where you have information in here and why do you care about the CMDB team, right? And why do you want them to be involved? And so, another quick poll question. Um, where do you think you fall in the maturity model? Um, I have a rough idea of where usually most folks are, but would definitely be curious to know how this current audience is.
Yeah, and for those, if you don't see the poll pop up, the three buttons up there should lead you to a tab, and the three choices are, hey, A, manual operations, B is going to be automated prioritization, C, improved remediation, and three, enterprise risk training. So thanks for those that are starting to click on that. We'll share those results in a moment. Um, did have one question come in terms of the prioritization piece that you're talking about. And when you're looking at risk management, is it are you typically starting with enterprise applications? Where do you begin the discussion on under what should really fall under the governance of the vulnerability risk program?
That's actually a great question. There is a part that I talk about it, but I can definitely address part of that question. What you want to do is when you're initially coming to deploy vulnerability response, you want to pick a certain segment of your infrastructure that you're familiar with. Like for example, like who the owners are, what the infrastructure looks like, and you have a rough idea where it's like, okay, we know that this particular data center in, say, California, we want to run the scans, we want to see what it looks like, and then we want to be able to see if the CMDB integration is pointing to the right owners and the right set of priorities, and then slowly start expanding that to other sites and other infrastructure. So it's really a prioritization game where you're trying to figure out what would be the first best set of environments to tackle that you're familiar with, and then start heading out to ones that are less familiar and probably a lower prioritization.
Yeah, no, no, makes sense. So I think we've got enough votes in here, and I'll just kind of share verbally, what we're seeing. So from the respondents that have kind of tracked in here, and I'll go back to this list so we can see it while I kind of share the results. Um, we've got 20 responses have us at manual, 23 have us at automated prioritization, and then we had 10 responses at improved remediation, and we have a couple that are actually at enterprise risk trending. So a little bit of everything, but
Oh,
without question, most are in the 0 or 1 spot.
all right. So, as I mentioned before, we want to talk about the CMDB parts, right? So CMDB, for those not familiar with it, is a centralized, what's called a configuration management database. What that means is really in IT world where a lot of your key information and assets information is stored. This covers not just the devices themselves or even software, but really like the interconnected services and some of the other components around that. Um, Another key thing to notice or keep a note about is like the CI class information. So these are usually extensions of the tables that exist. We're not going to go too deep into it. I just really want you to understand, or the key point that I need you to understand is this is where everybody goes to figure out what things are and how they're interconnected and how a business could be impacted because of, say, a certain piece of asset and how it interacts. And so from a vulnerability perspective, we want to be able to share what we've discovered and find out how much the enterprise environment already knows about said asset that's been identified with a vulnerability. Next slide, please. Uh, here's an example of getting them both together, right? So like now that you've run your vulnerability scanner, you've got the host, you've matched them to vulnerabilities, and so You also have your CMDB information. You combine the two, and you're really looking at what the ServiceNow vulnerability response tool is providing you, right? So you associate the hosts with, that were scanned with the CMDB, and you figure out, okay, well, which is known as CI matching. This will let you know what the host is and what their information is. And then the other part of that is really figuring out, okay, if this host has vulnerabilities, then I still need to match it to the CI. So you have these what are called vulnerable items. And so this is where you start prioritizing. And so if you see like some of the stuff listed as like VI grouping, for example, the VI is really the vulnerability item grouping. So you start grouping, say, like all your Linux servers in a particular geo fall into this. And so you know which team to do the auto assignment for. You have some of the risk-based prioritization. Again, a lot of that information you need from the CMDB to help figure out what to prioritize. Uh, and then some of the other stuff that we'll also talk about a little later is really how this also can help the CMDB to get better, more enriched data inside the CMDB.
Yeah, and a great note on that, I think, would be the improved intelligence of the CMDB through this process makes all those other processes smarter as well, whether it's incident management, request management, change management. The beautiful thing about this is, one process getting stronger has that ripple effect in terms of as you're putting out fires at the service desk, you're doing change management on a scheduled basis. Now you've got a lot more information to work with upstream and downstream.
I think somebody asked a question about when speaking about prioritization, is there a way to indicate certain CIs or crown jewels or pillar applications? There's actually a few ways to do that. It's probably a little out of scope for this call, but yes, there's ways to do that in terms of you can modify the risk scoring behavior. You can also use tagging, and I believe there's another way which slips my mind, but we can have a follow-up discussion about that after. Connect with me after. I would love to continue this conversation. All right. Kind of continuing on about like CMDB and set expectations and environment. Too often, environments, enterprises will be like, we have a pretty good CMDB. Yeah, we could improve it, but it's stable, it's established, it has what we think we need. More times than not, it's not usually ready for VR because what happens is VR will go in and start scanning your whatever environment you pick. Hence, going back to the earlier discussion point about making sure you pick an environment that you're familiar with, that you have a rough idea in terms of how much vulnerabilities are going to be in there or how many assets are in the environment, because what's going to happen is it's going to inject a large volume of uh, new CIs into your CMDB. And the way it does that is that it creates this placeholder, right? So you have this unmatched CIs placeholder that's created. Excuse me. Um, and so now, uh, as these unmatched CIs are coming in, you need to start really thinking about, okay, well, how do we reconcile some of this stuff? We're going to start. Uh, we'll cover it a little later, but you might start seeing like, what, our CMDB doesn't really have information on all these things, or some of the information is not really where it needs to be. And so now, going back to the whole theme of, well, VR and CMDB really need to work together. You really need to tie in your CMDB owners, have these conversations early about, okay, well, what if we find these vulnerabilities, and what in these particular cases and scenarios, what do we do about it? And so if you go to the next slide, this is usually the first case scenario, right? So like the first thing you do is you run the scanner. The scanner imports all this data, and it starts doing it does the lookups to find out, okay, well, are these in the CMDB? Let's assume yes. And then if you go to yes, you're like, okay, well, let's create this discovered items list. And in here, you have these multiple case scenarios, right? We'll get a little bit more deeper into this later, but it's really about either you have the complete information, you know who owns it, you know the business impact, you know its priority, you know how to get it fixed, and you know what's going on. And so that's the first case if you have if it's perfect. And then obviously the other option, like I mentioned before, is it could be incomplete. You could be missing certain things, and it's back to making sure talking to the CMDB team to say, okay, you know what, I need to know, is this business critical, or I need to know the version of an application, or it's just missing some key information that's not there. And then the other one that's really tough is like the data is just wrong, right? It's usually the worst case because now you're like you assume that this is a low priority, it could be a high priority, and so those are always tricky situations that you need to be aware of. Next slide, please. So the other one is when you have created uh, you know it, you create these undiscovered items that are unmatched, right? Like so your discovered items have unmatched stuff. So now you really need to figure out, okay, well, what do we do here? And this again, can't stress this enough. The CMDB team and the vulnerability team really need to work together, have some type of system that's not. It's not all about technology. It's really about communicating with people, working with each other, building out processes and procedures to help cover these kind of components. And here, when you get to the next scan, so if you go to the next import of scanner data, you'll see that, hey, what's the relevant existing discovered item? So it'll scan and see what's currently existing, how did it get worked on, and hopefully if it's been resolved, you'll get a complete. And if not, then you go back and say, okay, well, you know, is this new? And if it's new, do we have the matching information in the CMDB? If not, and then hence you kind of go through that. Go to the next slide. Um, so as I alluded to earlier, it's really about these two types of discovered items, right? So like if you have complete, this is the one that everybody wants, right? You want it matched, and when it's matched, you want it to be complete. You want it to have all the data that's relevant to making good practical decisions for your enterprise. This means that you're able to figure out who to assign it for, you know what the risk and impact is to the business. So in case you say, hey, you know what, we're going to defer this or we'll do this later, it's not a decision made with poor data, but accurate data that you can justify and go through any kind of information around that. Um, Similar as I mentioned earlier, it's really, there could be some key information missing, and this is really where talking with the CMDB team, talking with the other organization, making sure that you start to clean up the CMDB. This is what I mentioned earlier, where it's now enrichment to the CMDB. Imagine if you're able to continuously groom and have good CMDB hygiene, which is what I call it, meaning you're just constantly cleaning, you're organizing, you're seeing stuff, and you're like, oh well, let's fill this in. Um, right? You have the wrong stuff. The information doesn't really get what you need, and you're really you really need to figure out how to get this resolved. Again, you're fixing up your CMDB, you're cleaning your infrastructure, you get a better visualization, you get a better sense of what's going on in your organization. And back the second type of the discovered items is really unmatched. And that's really, it might seem really bad, especially since we have it all in red, but that's a good thing to know, right? Now you know that there's stuff in here that you're not even aware of, right? Inside your enterprises, there are not only just vulnerabilities, there are vulnerabilities on items that you're not even tracking, you're not even aware of them. And so that I think is a value point. Um, Another poll question, do you know who to engage with now? Right? Like after you've seen some of the explanation and the breakdown and some of the points in particular, uh, hopefully there's a particular team that I want you to work with as part of the discussion.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think while we let some folks kind of log or track that, what we could probably do is bring it to kind of a summary here, and talk a little bit about, when we step back, the importance of collaboration, right? And I think that's what we're getting at in terms of, knowing who to work with and who to go to. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah. Good point, John. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, there's a CMDB team. They want to know, um, obviously, they're responsible for figuring out what's in the environment, what's in the CMDB. So you want to make sure you communicate that, hey, once VR is up and running, it will be an opportunity, right, to enrich, get CI enrichment data, make sure you're improving your CMDB. Again, you find stuff that they might not be aware of, you find stuff that doesn't have the right data, and really work through a process of figuring out, okay, well, if we have this CI matching information, how do we um, propagate it properly and in a fashion that makes sense for the CMDB team? Obviously, the add-on for the remediation teams are they will know what to work on in terms of a prioritized manner, and there is some structure to how they approach what they're working on, right?
Yeah. So, Rahimi, question for you, for those planning, right? So, from what you've shown today, can you talk a little bit about the ServiceNow platform, the licensing, like what's needed for that? And where I'm headed with it, as far as part of this discussion, is some of our clients already own the integrated risk management pack solution. Some of them don't. Regardless, though, it sounds like the first step is looking at the status of your CMDB, not just the quality of the current data in your CMDB, but your process around the CMDB, and having that updated and being able to rely on the data in there. Is that accurate?
Uh, kinda. So you're heading in the right direction. So the first two parts. One is this is part of vulnerability response is part of the secure SecOps um, product suite. So the
Yep.
security operations product suite.
SecOps. Yep.
And so that's the first part. And from last I recall, I haven't looked at the licensing in a while, but VR has its own licensing SKUs. So there is like a standard, a pro, and an enterprise.
Yep.
So that'll also be part of some of the capabilities and stuff. Um, and then the part about like how to work with the CMDB, it's really about communication more than hey, VR is coming, be ready. So like it's not like that. It's really, hey, what's a good area that you guys are familiar with when you're talking to CMDB team? What area are you familiar with? We want to run the scan. The scan could potentially add new CIs. It's going to find some information, and we want to work out a remediation process between each other to resolve, like, say, naming, let's say host names are incorrect or incorrect information. We need to work out that process internally so that then when we start expanding the scope of the vulnerability response tool, we have a
Yep.
way to work through it. Another point is also you want to figure out the impact to your ServiceNow instance when you do this. So because you're going to be starting to have a large amount of data getting ingested into your instance, it's good to also talk to your ServiceNow support team and get a support ticket out there. We generally handle that at CDW, where coordinate that part of it as well. But in general, you want to make sure that your instance is sized and set for the right specs for when you start doing that.
Great. Yeah, makes perfect sense. And by the way, that last survey response, looks like we got over 90%, said yes, in terms of kind of knowing where to go from this point.
Awesome. Awesome.
That's good. Um, Another question we've got, that actually a couple questions have come in, so I'll kind of read these here for you. One question is, I'd like to understand the table for unmatched for CMDB. Typically, we create all the records discovered and then have governance in place for those missing a relationship and a manual attribute. So is there anything you can add or share to that?
That's actually the way we want you to work through, right? So like if it's unmatched in the CMDB, yes, you want the governance, um you want to be able to work out the relationship and just define it. So that's great. That's exactly where you want to be.
Great. Yeah, another question. If somebody does already own another product like Tanium, right? Um, do we still need a Snow vulnerability release license, or what is the approach around getting those kind of working together?
So I'm not quite sure the question. So let me take a stab at it. So one is your vulnerability scanner, and then the other is your vulnerability response tool from ServiceNow. So, um, what your what the vulnerability response tool is just the center point for ingestion for where your, say for this example, your Tanium vulnerability scanner, that data would then get ingested into VR. So you would still, if you want to use the ServiceNow VR module, you would need a license for it.
Okay.
If I think that's what the question is.
Yeah. No, I think that got it, but if it didn't, please feel free to follow up with another question or some more details, and we're happy to follow up even
Yes,
after
please.
we close the session out here today. So I know we've got a couple of takeaway items that I'm going to cover here in a sec, but anything else that you've got, Rahimi, for us?
No, no,
No?
I think it was good.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. A lot covered. And for those that have been asking, um, absolutely. So what normally will happen is we'll follow up and send you a link to this recorded session so you could share it with others or kind of watch part of it again. If you'd like a copy of the actual presentation, just let us know. You can do that here in chat, or you can shoot us an email. And if you'd like a one-on-one discussion, and this is where I wanted to share, if you're a CDW customer, or even if you're thinking of becoming one, you've got access to a lot of resources here. You've heard about our ServiceNow practice a little bit today, and if you'd like to have a chat with Rahimi or part of the team to kind of dive a little bit deeper into any of what you saw today or some other things you're thinking about, we're here for that. You can reach out to me via email and I can get you in touch with the right people. Or if you've got a CDW account executive that you work with regularly, they can get you to us as well. So we want to make sure that you've got everything you need, but also if there are other topics that you're interested in, you'd like to see us maybe schedule that for next month or the month after that, shoot us a note as well. We're looking to do more and more creative stuff in these free educational workshops that we do every month. And we're just kind of starting to build out that calendar for January and as we head in 2024. So first of all, thank you so much for everyone who took the time to join. Thank you, Rahimi, for giving us that tour. And for those of you that asked, we'll make sure you get a copy of the deck, and happy to have a follow-up call with you if there's anything else we can help you with. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was a pleasure.